That's it for a quick compilation of the best moments from this build. Now, I'll show you what I used against normal enemies, which also works perfectly on dummies. I'll also walk you through what you can expect in this video. But before we dive into the details, welcome to my updated guide for the legendary Masamune sword, also known as the Katana. After another month of playing with this weapon, I've learned a ton. This video will focus mostly on what's new compared to the previous build, to keep things as short and straight to the point as possible. If you're looking for a full breakdown where I cover everything, from how to get the weapon, tons of tips and tricks, my thoughts on the build, and much more, make sure to check out my previous guide. Here's what you'll find in this video. Light and heavy style katana builds, the best mods for every gear slot, top deviants for this build, the best skin choices for your gear, my Cradle pick for the Way of Winter scenario, optimized gear for elites and bosses, all food buff options, the best armor choices, all crit rate sources, and even more. Stick around until the end. There's a ton of game-changing tips you won't want to miss. With another 100 hours of experience on this build, I've packed everything into this guide that might even help with other builds. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any future quality content, and feel free to leave a comment. I'm always here to answer your questions. Recently, I hit 1,000 subscribers, which is my biggest milestone so far. A huge thank you to everyone who's been part of this journey and helped build this amazing community. My next big goal is reaching 2,000 subscribers, and I'd love for you to join me in making it happen. Since this is still a fresh adventure for me, every bit of your support means the world. Thanks for being here and making it all possible. Let me show you my gear variation for bosses and elites. For these tougher enemies, you'll want to switch up your mods to focus on bonuses that target elites, or great ones, instead of regular mobs. When it comes to food, if you're planning to mark enemies, the mixed fried hot dog is going to be your go-to option. Everything else stays the same. Let's jump right into weapons and break down the weapon effects that are absolutely crucial for understanding a lot of the mechanics behind all builds in the game. Starting with primary weapon, we've got the Fabled Masamune. When the weapon's durability is above 50%, for every 1% higher, you gain 3% critical damage, maxing out at 120%. That means as long as the durability stays above 90%, you'll get the full bonus. But when the durability drops below 20%, for every 1% lower, your attack decreases by 2%. The most important feature is the quick draw attack. Basically, when you perform a quick attack, it doesn't always mean pressing the left mouse button. You can even start the combo with a heavy attack using the right mouse button. If done right, you'll get a 30% attack boost and a guaranteed crit hit. Just keep in mind, this doesn't work against other players. The effect can be triggered once every 15 seconds. If the attack lands, the buff lasts for 5 seconds but decays over time. That means the 30% attack boost and 100% crit rate will gradually drop every second, and by the end of the 5 seconds, it's down to about 40% of its original value. For your secondary weapon, we'll be rocking the recurve crossbow. When you hit a weak spot, it triggers Bullseye, which boosts your crit rate by 15% for 10 seconds. On top of that, Bullseye applies an 8% vulnerability debuff for 12 seconds, making enemies take extra damage. That's all for the gear effects, as there's no key armor piece that really synergizes with this build. Now, let me show you my buffed and unbuffed stats before we move on to the damage recap. As you saw in the clips, we were hitting around 240,000 on the dummy, and about 200,000 on normal enemies and elites. Unfortunately, I don't have a clip of the 290,000 hit on an elite, which is almost the max damage you can deal with this build per heavy attack. Pretty insane, right? I'm working with limited disk storage, so I have to stop recording from time to time. Because of that, I sometimes forget to start recording again, and I end up missing some sweet moments. I genuinely think 300,000 per heavy attack is achievable in real scenarios, like fights against elites or bosses, but not against normal enemies or dummies. Well, this build performs way better in actual combat situations than during dummy tests. First off, against dummies and normal enemies, my stats aren't fully optimized. I'm missing 24% damage against normal enemies from mods. That would be a massive boost if I started grinding for better mods. Second, this build shines in open-world combat because of the new Cradle, Tough perk, which increases melee damage by 25% after killing an enemy. The buff lasts 15 seconds, but you can't really proc it near your base during dummy tests. Another major thing we missed during dummy damage tests is the 3-piece bonus from the blast set effect, which boosts the damage of your next melee attack by 25% after killing an enemy. When you combine all these buffs and time everything perfectly, I'd say 300,000 per slash is totally possible. By the way, if you're enjoying the content, don't forget to drop a like on the video. It really helps out. Thanks. Now that you know my damage potential, let me show you a quick compilation of my damage progression since my last Katana guide. To learn what led to these damage improvements, stick around, as I'll explain everything you need to achieve this in the game. As you can see, my damage has improved massively since my last build guide. I still remember the first time I hit 60,000 per slash. That was a big moment. Now, I'm getting close to hitting 300,000 damage per slash, which is my next goal. So, make sure to subscribe and join me on this journey. Let's keep improving together. If you have any tips on what I could change, feel free to share them in the comments. Every suggestion is welcome. Before we dive into all aspects of optimizing this build, let me quickly remind you, if you're interested in a light attack katana setup, stick with me. I'll be highlighting ways to improve this variation throughout the optimization process. But first, why would you want to play this setup? This build variation offers much more mobility, higher attack speed, and flashier attack patterns. Plus, it makes animation cancels easier to pull off. If done right, I predict this setup could achieve similar total DPS over time, with smaller individual numbers but much faster attacks. So, in the end, it's all about what you prefer, big, slow hits or quick, flashy strikes. We'll begin with armor selection. If you want my in-depth armor guide, I recommend checking out my previous video, where I break down the pros and cons of different sets and explain which ones just don't work for melee builds. First up, let's talk about heavy attack setup. For this, we'll be running 3 times Blast and 3 times Falcon armor pieces. The key here, after picking the set, is to craft them on the right gear slots. Since this build doesn't scale with PSI intensity, our main focus is on maximizing HP bonuses. That's why Falcon armor pieces should go on slots that provide the highest HP bonuses. Falcon is an epic grade set, while Blast is rare, so the higher rarity naturally gives better stats. Here's the breakdown. Use Falcon pieces on the top, pants, and boots. For the remaining slots, helmet, mask, and gloves, go with the Blast set. The same principle applies to upgrading your blueprints. Focus on enhancing these key pieces first. If you can't upgrade everything at once, Prioritize the ones that'll give you the biggest stat boosts. Now, let's switch to the light katana setup. For this, the blast set is a no-go, since we're not using heavy attacks. Instead, we'll run 2x rustic pieces and 1x Stormweaver for reduced roll cost. The standout piece here is Stormweaver, so you'll want to craft it for your top slot. Then go for 3 falcon pieces on pants, boots, and gloves. Rustic pieces are perfect for the helmet and mask, since those slots offer the smallest HP bonuses. Pro tip: if you're crafting the rustic set for melee damage bonuses, make sure to craft it from the tent. If you use the gear workbench, you'll end up with cold resistance instead, something you likely don't need. And that's it for armor selection. Heavy builds focus more on raw damage, while light attack setups are all about mobility. Choose the one that fits your style, and you're good to go. Now that you know which armor pieces to choose, let's move on to the new mechanics from the Way of Winter scenario: animal skins that enhance gear effects. I'll also guide you through the best farming routes to collect all the skins mentioned here, in case you're not into taming or you're still in Phase 1 of Way of Winter. We'll cover the top skin choices for each gear piece. If you've got suggestions or tips, drop them in the comments. Starting with the helmet, you'll want something for a defensive boost. I haven't fully tested if the damage reduction stat works in PvE, or whether NPCs can hit weak spots, so if you know, let me know in the comments. Assuming it works, my top picks are wool, rock wall wool, and golden wool. Golden wool is the best option because of its higher damage reduction against all instances, including weak spots and status effects. For the top and pants, go with Westland wolf skin. The bonus to sprint speed and max stamina is incredible. That extra stamina is a game changer for melee builds, giving you more flexibility with your katana. Gloves are all about preference. You can boost gathering speed or yield. I personally prefer legendary crocodile skin for extra logging and mining yield on the final hit. For shoes, pick a skin that enhances mobility. Grassland wolf skin is my go-to because it gives a flat 8% movement speed bonus when your stamina exceeds 80. With up to 400 stamina in this build, it's super easy to keep this bonus active. Finally, for the mask, go for damage boosting skins. Beach crocodile skin gives a 7% melee crit rate, while reindeer hide offers 12% melee damage when your load exceeds 80. This isn't hard to maintain with backpack expansions. Pick whichever fits your playstyle. They're both great. Now that we've nailed the best skin options, let's move on to Cradle optimization. In this scenario, the devs have revamped nearly all cradles, making many of them more viable for different builds. Right now, I'm using one cradle setup for PvE that works perfectly across all content. Here's my current set, and I'll explain what's changed for melee builds. The first big change is the revamped pistol cradle, which now also boosts melee weapon damage. This is a huge win for melee players. Another major addition is the tough build cradle. It increases melee damage by 25% after killing an enemy, and it restores 10% of lost HP and stamina. This is exactly what we needed to improve survivability. It feels like the devs watched my previous katana build guide. If that's true, and you're watching again, drop a yes in the comments. Since we've got one slot free, I went for a status enhancement, which won't directly boost our damage. But did you know status damage actually enhances your deviant damage? For more quality tips like this one, where I break down what else can boost your deviant damage, check out my all-in-one PvE guide. It's based on the Jaws pistol and covers everything you need to improve your PvE gameplay. Now that you know which cradles to pick, let's dive into food buffs, character weight optimization, and all my food-related tips. If I missed something, hit me up in the comments. Starting with the energy buff, we've got two really solid options. The first is Stargazy Pie, which boosts critical strike damage against all targets when your energy is full. It's the more flexible choice since it works on all enemy types and is less situational than the next option, but it offers slightly lower damage. The better choice, in specific cases, is the mixed fried hot dog. It's easier to make and increases damage to enemies marked by bullseye. This one offers the highest damage boost, but requires marking your enemies, which can be tricky when using a katana. I'd only recommend it for party play if you're okay with frequently switching to a secondary weapon to mark targets, or if you have mimetic specialization for scout drones. For the hydration buff, we also have two options. The first is a new addition from the Way of Winter, All-Weather Stew. It increases your max stamina by 30% and boosts both heat and cold resistance by 30%. This is huge on both fronts. More stamina means you can maintain mobility and damage for longer, while the resistances free up your armor and pants skin choices, so you don't have to focus on cold or heat resist. The second option is Iced Tea. It used to be my go-to because it boosts mobility, making it easier to close gaps with enemies or dodge attacks. However, with the current weather mechanics, it's not as effective as before. Since meat buffs don't stack anymore, we have to pick one. My go-to is rabbit meat, which grants an additional 40 stamina. As always, more stamina means an easier time playing melee builds. If you can afford it, pristine rabbit meat is even better, but that's up to you. Now for some cooking tips. First, find someone who can build an enhanced kitchen set, with 2 bonus effects to maximize food buffs and reduce spoilage. Always use your Chefosaurus Rex with the highest skill rating, and make sure to manage its mood by taking it out of the isolated securement unit when you're not cooking, to avoid mood and power depletion. For mimetic specializations, if you're making canned food, the canned goods specialization increases yield by +1. For iced tea, the ice treat specialization is excellent, increasing buff duration by 200% and effects by 30%. Stardust Dish is also great, providing 2 special whim effects and HP recovery when sanity is full, lasting for 30 minutes. Lastly, keep a portable fridge in your inventory to reduce food spoilage by 90%. Let's talk about character weight and how it impacts PvE performance. Since being slim decreases your damage but increases attack speed, players running a light katana setup should aim for the lightweight category. For heavy attack builds, the middleweight category is ideal. It's the best balance between attack speed and damage. I wouldn't recommend heavyweight as you lose too much attack speed, which hurts your performance during your weapon's passive. For 5 seconds after attacking, you get a bonus to attack and crit rate. With middleweight, you just barely have enough attack speed to get 5 hits in during this window. Dropping your speed further would make it impossible to hit that threshold. That wraps up food buffs, cooking tips, and character weight optimization. After covering everything about cooking and character weight, we're diving into the next topic: calibration choices and secondary weapons. Let's start with calibrations, since it's a quick one. For melee weapons, you've got 2 styles to choose from. Hard Striker, perfect for heavy attack builds, and Light Striker for light attack setups. When it comes to secondary weapons, the options are limited, but you can equip 2 support weapons instead of 1. Unfortunately, you can't dual-wield melee weapons in one preset, which would have been a game changer. For now, the go-to is the Recurve Crossbow for its crit rate buff and vulnerability debuff. If you want something simpler, AWS Bullseye works great for applying vulnerability too. Another solid pick, especially against bosses or when you need super armor, is the Sandstorm Shotgun. Pair it with the new Cradle, which increases Fortress Warfare range by 50%. Add the Ginger Drop food buff for an extra 5 seconds on Fortress Warfare's duration, and you'll maximize the Cradle's boost even further. If Fortress Warfare is active for at least 5 seconds, the buff reapplies within a 10-meter range. To sum it up, with melee weapons, you can run 2 support weapons. I recommend the AWS Bullseye paired with the Recurve Crossbow, or swap the Bullseye for the Sandstorm Shotgun when super armor is needed. That's it for calibrations and support weapons for this build. Now, let's dive into the next topic in today's video, the biggest one: everything about mods. Before we get started, if you haven't watched my video where I break down mods, I highly recommend checking it out. In that video, I cover everything, from damage tests to figuring out which stats are the best. I also go over topics like diminishing returns on battle stats, getting more controllers, and optimizing the mod conversion system, so you can snag your best-in-slot mods as easily as possible. And trust me, there's way more to it than that. Alright, assuming you've seen that, let's jump straight into mod choices, including the best stats to look for while farming or converting mods. Starting with support weapons, for vulnerability applying weapons, you'll want the Vulnerability Amplifier mod, which enhances the debuff by an extra 8%. For the Sandstorm shotgun, I run Portable Territory. However, keep in mind that mods only apply when you're actively using the weapon, so you won't benefit from it most of the time. For the Katana mods, unfortunately, we lack a strong legendary option. However, the Recover Mark mod deserves a mention since it provides great sustain by restoring HP and stamina. Pair it with a Wildfire pistol to spread marks across multiple enemies. Your main choice will be a blue mod, Crit Boost if you need more crit rate, or Melee Amplifier for higher damage. I prefer Crit Boost, but always go with whichever mod has better attributes. Alright, moving on to the Helmet mod. There's really only one solid option, Fateful Strike. It's perfect since we don't rely on weak spot hits, and it gives both crit rate and crit damage, exactly what we need. For the Mask mod, the best choice is Targeted Strike, which boosts crit rate and crit damage significantly. The downside? It only works against marked enemies, and the katana can't apply Bullseye on its own. Use the Recurve Crossbow, AWS Bullseye, Wildfire Pistol, Mimetic Specialization on Scout Drones, or rely on a party member to apply the debuff. Other options are blue mods, like Crit Damage Enhancement for more crit rate and damage, or Melee Amplifier for a pure damage boost. I typically go with Targeted Strike, since I use the Scout Drone with Mimetic Specialization. For the top mod, you've got three choices. First is Head-On Conflict, a defensive mod providing almost constant 20% damage reduction, a solid pick for melee builds. The other two are Crit Damage Enhancement or Melee Amplifier. I go with Melee Amplifier here for more raw damage. For the Pants slot, Melee Momentum is the obvious pick. It increases melee damage by 20%, and melee kills restore 30% of your stamina. It's a no-brainer. Glove mods have three great options. Melee Amplifier for a 20% melee damage boost, Crit Amplifier for both crit rate and crit damage, and Crit Boost for 15% crit rate. If your crit rate is fine, go with Melee Amplifier. Otherwise, Crit Amplifier or Crit Boost will do the job. For boots, there are three options. Ferocious Charge gives a damage bonus, but requires you to kill enemies every 8 seconds, which isn't always feasible. Covered Advance offers the same buff but activates after 4 seconds without taking damage, which is hard to manage in melee combat. Lastly, Rush Hour offers the highest damage bonus but requires you to maintain low HP. Risky but rewarding. I stick with Covered Advance for consistency, resetting the buff before big fights. For mod attributes, prioritize the Violent perk on all mods except melee-specific ones, which have other valuable stats like crit rate and crit damage. Avoid useless attributes like elemental damage, status damage, weapon damage, and anything tied to ranged weapons. Focus on crit damage, bonus damage to the enemies you fight, and HP. For melee-specific mods, go for melee damage, crit rate, crit damage, and, again, bonus damage to the enemies you fight. By the way, if you still haven't farmed your blue mods, check out my guide on the Manibus scenario. It's available on my channel. For the Way of Winter scenario, you'll have to wait a bit longer for the updated farming route for blue mods. Now, moving on to crit rate sources. This is super important for this weapon build since it's crit-based. First off, every weapon has a base crit rate. For the katana, it's 5%. From Calibration, you can get between 12% and 16%. Glove mods can give either 10% or 15%, depending on which one you use. If you're missing anything in your build, go for Crit Boost. The top mod, Crit Damage Enhancement, gives you 2%. The Helmet mod, Fateful Strike, adds 10%. The Mask mod, Targeted Strike, gives 10% crit rate against marked enemies. For tips on using this mod efficiently, check the mod section of this video. If you often use your crossbow, you can add another 15% crit rate buff. From melee-specific mod attributes, you can get up to 6% crit rate. If you're using the Falcon set, you can add 5% crit rate if you have at least 90 stamina. Just note that the item's translation is incorrect. It says you need 90% of your stamina, but what it actually requires is 90 points. If your stamina is maxed at 400, that 90% still equals 90 points. Combine everything you'll be using and aim for 60% crit rate. After that, focus on melee damage, crit damage, and bonus damage to enemies. Why aim for 60%? That's the optimal crit rate when you factor in the katana's passive. Every 15 seconds, performing a quick attack gives you a guaranteed crit. This effect decays over 5 seconds. Each second, you lose 20% crit rate from the initial 100%. With 60% base crit rate, all your attacks during this window will land as critical hits, drastically boosting your damage. This is when you'll see your highest numbers. To maximize your DPS during that 5-second window, aim for 60% crit rate. But if you prefer more consistent damage, you can go for as much crit rate as you want. Good luck finding what works best for you. By the way, if you have any questions or want to share tips, hit me up in the comments. And if you appreciate the work I do, drop a like and subscribe so you don't miss any quality videos in the future. Now, let's talk about my best tips and tricks from playing this build over the past month. For a full list of tips, including my thoughts on the katana build, check out my previous video. First and most importantly, get yourself a gear workbench with 30% more durability and the thermal tower upgrade, temperature-resistant treatment. This gives an additional 30% durability to your gear. It's crucial for maintaining higher damage over longer fights. Another related tip: repair your weapon when it's at 60 to 70% durability to minimize damage loss during combat due to the weapon's passive. Additionally, make sure you have at least one Artisan's Touch Deviant working in your territory. This gives you access to a tactical item that lets you repair your gear anywhere on the map. In my previous guide, I mentioned that upgrading melee weapons didn't give any benefits, but I was wrong. So I recommend focusing on upgrading your blueprints. If you're not familiar with the blueprint upgrading system or want tips on how I've already maxed out 10 legendary gear pieces, check out my full video packed with advice. Next, let's talk about animation canceling. Use the throwing dagger tactical item to quickly hide and draw your sword. This allows you to reapply the weapon's passive, which requires drawing your sword. Another big tip is about pre-buffing. Since the developers revamped execution for melee weapons, you can now consistently buff your character with 3 buffs in one action. One execution grants buffs from both Cradles, and if you're using a heavy attack style build, you'll also get a buff from the 3-piece blast set. 25% more damage for the next attack and plus 15% swing speed. This is a huge boost, especially considering how easy these buffs are to trigger. If you need to adjust your character's weight, eat fish and chips to gain weight. To lose weight quickly, drink fat-burning juice or eat spoiled food, then use an antibiotic to stop the process. Here are a few extra PvE tips for all weapons, not just the katana. First, always check the mutations in hard or pro mode silos and monoliths. Ignoring them can lead to over 50% damage reduction or even cause you to fail the dungeon. Mutations reset every Sunday, so check them at the start of each week. Another important tip is to use whims effectively. My favorites are the Weaver, which leaves a spider web that chains and slows enemies after rolling, and the Transformation Cookie, which turns you into an object and lets you skip unnecessary enemies, saving time. The transformation ends after performing any action except jumping. Finally, Living Armor is a lifesaver. When your HP drops to 20%, it restores your HP and sanity to full within 5 seconds. For tactical items, I recommend the Scout Drone with the mimetic specialization for the bullseye effect. This marks targets automatically, so you can focus on mods and food that work against marked enemies. The portable turret with the mimetic specialization is also amazing. It gains the bounce effect, boosting its damage and HP while drawing aggro. In Way of Winter scenario, there are new mimetic specializations: the freezing drone, which slows nearby enemies, and explosive ammo for turrets, which gives MG turret bullets a chance to trigger the unstable bomber effect for more damage. Finally, let's talk about top deviation choices for the katana build. For now, there are 2 standout options. The first is Zeno-Purifier, which lets you blink to faraway enemies, deals great damage, and provides sustain with every melee attack. It's perfect for melee builds and looks awesome. The second is Enchanting Void. This Deviant transforms to a panther that automatically attacks enemies, increasing their melee damage taken by 200% for 20 seconds. It's insane for single target damage, doubling your damage output during its effect. In Combat Assist mode, it boosts your movement speed by 10% while holding a melee weapon and restores 10% of max HP on melee hits. However, it's not as good as Zeno-Purifier for clearing the open world. Both Deviants excel in survivability, making them top-tier picks for melee builds. That's it for my tips. If you haven't watched my full PvE guide on increasing damage for any build, check it out for tons of useful tips. Thanks for sticking around. If you enjoy my content, drop a like and subscribe for more Once Human content. See you in the next one.